Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in the Geocurrents series on historical demography. Today I'm going to outline the debate between pro-natalists, those who want to increase birth rates, and anti-natalists, those who want to decrease birth rates. I will give their arguments, responses to these arguments from the other sides, responses to these responses, and so on. As is always the case, I am not going to take sides in these debates, or this debate, if you will. My goal, rather, is to give you information and outline the ideas that are out there so that you can think for yourself on these issues. So I'll start with the anti-natalist position. The beginning argument is that the Earth is already severely overpopulated. In the first lecture in this series, I gave some data on that. One of the ways this is framed is by arguing that human beings already are using up more renewable resources than the Earth produces, which leads to the idea of overshoot. So you can see this graphic from the World Wildlife Fund giving the day in the year in which supposedly the renewable resources produced by the Earth have been consumed by this date. Now, these are difficult things to calculate, and there's a lot of debate about this, but it's this idea is very widespread in environmental circles on the anti-natalist side of the debate. So there's a big question of whether we are currently using up the renewable resources of the Earth or using up those of 1.7 Earths. Like I say, it is difficult to calculate these sort of things, and there's a lot of contention. One way I like to address these is by putting the question to ChatGPT. Not that I think ChatGPT is going to give me a correct answer, but rather that it's going to give an answer that reflects a certain degree reflects common opinion. So as ChatGPT says, and I think this is incontrovertible, that the carrying capacity of the Earth, how many people can the Earth support, depends on the level of consumption. So it says here, if everybody on Earth lived like the average person in a high-income country, such as the United States, the Earth could only sustain about 1 or 2 billion people. Again, this is debatable. It quotes the very well-known biologist E.O. Wilson, who says that a population of 2 billion could live sustainably on the Earth, assuming a fairly high standard of living. But then also turns to the more radical deep ecology movement, which claims that to have a balanced environment, we need fewer than 1 billion people. So you're going to get different numbers depending on who you look at, but the environmental community in general would say that the 8 billion people who live on Earth are already well more than the Earth can sustain. And even if the Earth can support billions of people, the other big question is, well, will there be room enough for other species? So a graphic here from Population Matters, an anti-natalist organization, looks at the weight of all vertebrate land animals on Earth and claims that some 10,000 years ago, the end of the last glacial period, beginning of agriculture, that the total weight, we're looking at biomass here, of vertebrate land animals on Earth, that was 99% wild animals and 1% humans. Actually, I think that number is way too high. It's estimated that there were as few as 1 to 5 million humans at this time, and there were an awful lot of other vertebrate land animals, so I suspect it's much too high. The same graphic claims that today, well, the graphic says 1% wild animals. I've adjusted that to 1% terrestrial vertebrates. If you look at fish, for example, it doesn't work at all. Only 1% as opposed to 32% of that biomass from humans and 67% from the livestock animals that humans raise largely to eat or to use their milk. Now, I note that this number is perhaps too low. I spent quite a bit of time trying to check it, but it's very difficult to do, so there's a lot of guesswork. But again, there's no doubt that the weight of human beings and livestock greatly exceeds that of wild vertebrate terrestrial life. And we can see this in all sorts of realms. For example, there's still rampant ongoing deforestation in the tropics. Some exaggeration, sorry for the misspelling of this map. a map of deforestation fronts. Unlike these, most of these maps, it's by no means perfect. They're showing a huge amount of deforestation in the Cerrado of central Brazil. That is an area that has been largely converted to agriculture. But it was savanna landscape rather than forest. Also, a large area of eastern Australia that's actually sort of brushland or woodland, not forest. But the general point is well taken. And you can look at an island like Borneo. You can see it there in Southeast Asia. We can focus in on some maps that have been made showing the pace of deforestation. It was pretty much entirely tropical rainforest in 1950. There's plenty of people there, but they were much fewer than there are today, and were mostly in the coastal region. And you could just see this movement of deforestation, both logging for export and then transformation of the land from tropical rainforest to various forms of agricultural or pastoral lands. And not only are forests retreating, but so is wildlife. I could give you many, many examples here, but I'll give one, the retreat of the elephants. The map on the upper left just shows the Asian elephant and historical range. You can see all of southern China, almost all of the mainland Southeast Asia, India, and even, according to this map, into Iraq, what is today Iraq, which I have some doubt about, but certainly South Asia, eastern part of East Asia, Southeast Asia. This was elephant terrain. Map on the bottom shows both the African and Asian elephants in just sort of current habitat. It's all broken up, small areas. Map may actually be exaggerating. And in many of these areas, the retreat continues as population grows, particularly in Africa. It can be very difficult for people to get along with elephants, which can cause a lot of agricultural damage, so increasing conflicts and decreasing range of elephants. And it's interesting, too, if you go back go back to before 10,000 years ago, during the Pleistocene epoch, elephants and their close relatives, proboscideans, to use the precise taxonomic category, were almost everywhere. I mean, not in Australia, but throughout Eurasia, Africa, North and South America, and a number of these were quite abundant. What happened to elephants and their relatives in North and South America some 12,000 years ago when they went extinct is debatable, but most scholars think that human beings had a major role to play in that extinction. And I will talk about this in subsequent lectures. But just one more slide on this. If we were to go back to what is now the United States 15,000 years ago, area south of the glaciers, we would have found not just woolly mammoths that are well known, but also much larger Columbian mammoth. And I should say mammoths are essentially elephants. An Asian elephant is probably more closely related to a mammoth than it is to an African elephant. And then there were mastodons, which look a lot like elephants and are related to them, but are quite distinctive animal with very different teeth and diet and so on. But all of these were relatively abundant. So because of this incredible reduction of wildlife and wild habitat on the Earth, which is continuing to this day, and as population increases by more than 200,000 people a day, yes, that reduction in numbers and habitat continues. So the most extreme environmentalists say that the only real answer to this is voluntary human extinction. This is the view, and it's the most extreme view, not held by many, but some of them certainly get some attention, get the attention of the New York Times, for example, of the voluntary human extinction movement, people who view humanity as essentially a plague on the earth that is only going to destroy other species. The only way to do is to stop procreation or reproduction. Now, no surprise that has generated a very strong reaction. So interesting, Elon Musk, who's one of the more prominent pro-natalists, tweeted out this photo from the New York Times, claiming that the mind virus, which is what he refers to, more extreme environmentalism as well as general left-wing social ideology, he refers to it as a mind virus and claims it is pushing people towards extinction by discouraging reproduction and making it more difficult. Anyway, uh, since we're starting with the anti-natalists, the next section of this lecture is going to look at how anti-natalists are and have historically sought to reduce birth rates. So if you think that there are too many people and we need to reduce birth rates to lower the population of the earth down to a sustainable level, there are several ways to go about doing this, and the most obvious is public outreach. So I have on the left here just a campaign from a few decades ago from an Asian country when there was a real concern about rapid population growth in Asia, and so you get these sort of campaigns of 2 children is enough, don't have any more. And then the illustrations in the center and on the right are more recent, and this is from sort of a more extreme view. The woman in the center is a part of a protest movement in Bangalore, the Silicon Plateau of India, and just coming right out and say, stop making babies, as you see in the poster on the right. Stop having kids. Women are not baby making machines. So that's pretty extreme anti-natalism. But again, it's using the public outreach to do so. There's also a certain amount of public shaming. And I hesitated about whether I wanted to use this slide, the spread of the breeder slur, a pejorative term, as you can see from the Wikipedia article, coined by gay people, criticizing parents who supposedly overfocus on children and abandon previous friends and lifestyles. But then it also notes the term is used by anti-natalists. Now, I've added there some extreme anti-natalists, because it's certainly not most anti-natalists, just the more extreme, who pejoratively refer to anyone who has procreated as an act that they consider immoral. And one of the reasons I put this in is because last summer I was at an extended family gathering. A very heated discussion broke out over the issue of population. One young couple, these are all relatives of mine, but one young couple who have 3 children, 4 and under, thinking of having more, were disdained by a cousin who called them breeders. And the conversation got so heated at this time, I really had to intervene to try to calm everyone's feelings and calm the tensions. And I do note here that this kind of shaming can also backfire. The young couple in question have more recently related to me some of their experiences of being out with their children, an infant, a month old, a couple of 3 and a 4-year-old, and people that they barely know or not even know at all will come up and say, well, I hope you're finished now. I hope you're not going to have any more children. And the woman in question found this so infuriating. She told me that every time I hear something like that, I think, I'm going to continue having children. So anyway, just a little personal anecdote. How have anti-natalists sought to reduce the fertility rate? Number 2. This is more of a policy issue, though, of subsidizing small families and birth control. So when the notion of a population explosion gained a lot of attention back in the 1960s, 1970s, birth rates were still quite high in many countries at the time, a lot of governments started taking up these anti-natalist policies. You can see Singapore, essentially a city-state in Southeast Asia. But from 1972 to 87, they had these distinctive anti-natalist policies of giving low-cost access to contraception, creating family planning clinics, and making it easier for them to spread contraception and the like, using the media to promote smaller families, free education for smaller families, access to lower-cost health care for smaller families, sterilization programs, and so on. I mean, Singapore is But anyway, these policies, whether or not these policies were effective or not is debatable, but certainly the fertility rate of Singapore plummeted during this period. It may have happened regardless of these policies, but the policies certainly may have made it happen more quickly. And finally, another way that some countries have sought to reduce fertility is through state coercion. There are 2 prime examples here. One was China from 1979, 1980 or so, up until 2016, although it started being reduced before then. They had this so-called one-child policy where most families, not all, but most families in most circumstances, were not just encouraged to only have one children, but would suffer certain financial and other disabilities if they had more. So a fairly coercive program. Even more coercive was a much shorter-lived program in India, 75 to 77, which was a forcible sterilization program, particularly of men. You can see here some 11 million people forcibly sterilized against their will. This was done by the government of Indira Gandhi, really concerned about the population explosion and thinking they had to do something drastic to get it under control. It resulted in a tremendous amount of public opposition and brought down the government, which had to declare emergency and basically suspend democracy for a while to make this happen. That was not popular. One big question, though, is were these coercive anti-natalist efforts successful? If you look at the historical total fertility rate of India, and there's pretty good data for this, you can see the period of the forcible sterilization campaign, and you may be able to argue that the fertility rate declined a little faster in this period, but it really didn't change the slope of that line. Or you could look at China, and I have a little more doubt about these graphs here, their accuracy. They don't fit with all the graphs that I have seen, although it does come from the Pew Research Center, which is very highly regarded. But anyway, you could see that the birth rates were falling before it came into effect. According to this graph, it kind of plateaued afterwards and then dropped again. The biggest change in demographic change from China's one-child policy, though, was for an increasingly sex-skewed population, and which resulted from sex-selective abortions of female fetuses or unborn children, if you will. In East Asia and China in particular, there is a long cultural desire to maintain family lines so that people can honor their ancestors. The family lines are traced through male descent, and so a very strong desire for families to have a son, which meant a lot of sex-selective abortions of girls and a skewed sex ratio, which results in a lot of problems. It does decrease the total birth rate in the future because there are a lot more men than women in the population. Arguably leads to a lot of social tension because there are vast numbers of young men who would like to marry and are not able to do so. Current mainstream anti-natalism in the United States stresses the reduction of unintended births through greater access to reproductive health care, which they would define as contraception, abortion, and so on. So looking at the population connection, formerly zero population growth, this was a flyer I received recently from them. But to quote from it, in the United States alone, we have an astonishing 1.3 million unintended births annually, and that's out of about 3.6 million total births in the United States. So the argument here is about a third of total births are unintended, and if people had better access to contraception, abortion, and so on, that many, if not most of those babies would not be born, which they would like to see. Because they want to reduce the birth rate quite rapidly. And as you can see here, they argue that we can smash barriers to reproductive health care across the globe. I have a question at the bottom, though, which is whether the implication here is that unintended births are unwanted births, and those are not necessarily the same thing. There are a lot of people in the United States who are perfectly happy to have children, but they're not necessarily intending to have one, and they wouldn't want to terminate the pregnancy if they had the chance, so that could be a bit misleading. And of course, as we all know, anti-natalists in the United States are very concerned about growing abortion restrictionism in many U.S. states that has come about since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. This was a huge issue in the 2022 midterm elections. It probably cost the Republicans a number of House and perhaps even Senate seats, much more muted today, but it's still a major controversy. So moving on to the pro-natalist responses to anti-natalism. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of back and forth in this lecture. The first topic I'll take here is the pro-natalist argument that there is no population crisis. So, pro-natalists will generally argue that technological progress greatly enhances the human carrying capacity of the earth. In other words, how many people can live on the earth in a sustainable manner. And they would argue that as technology improves, that number goes way up, and that has been happening and will continue to happen. They also argue that technology allows a substitution of relatively of scarce resources by plentiful ones. One example would be moving from copper wire to fiber optic cables, which fiber optic cable is basically made of glass. It's much comes from silicon sand essentially, so quite plentiful and an improved ability to carry information, and so that has reduced the need for copper. Although there are plenty of other things happening that has increased the use of the need for copper. But anyway, the argument from pro-natalists is that economic growth is now being decoupled from resource use. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. We've actually had a lot of economic growth and a reduction in the use, or at least very little growth in the use of a lot of resources, and it comes about through technological development. They'd also argue, many would argue, some would argue, the real technological optimists particularly would argue that we will before long be able to mine the asteroids, and there's vast amounts of at least metal resources there. And then the climate issue, this is something I will address in much greater detail later on in this course, but just to briefly touch on it now, whereas anti-natalists say the climate crisis means we have to sort of redouble our efforts to reduce population. Pro-natalists would often argue that climate change is not really a major threat, and even if it is, it can be solved by nuclear power, fission today, eventually fusion. Now, like I note here, all these claims are deeply contested, and I'll go back to the counterarguments later on. But first, to give a few slides in support of this pro-natalist position. One is crop yields are continuing to rise. Now, anti-natalists would ask if that's sustainable, but if you look at almost all the major crops, from this World in Data graph set, with the exception of sorghum, all have seen major increases. Particularly, you could see very steep there in wheat, one of the main staple crops, and in rice. As, again, this is an issue of technological development, of agricultural intensification. And pro-natalists would argue that this can be, these trend lines can continue upwards. Anti-natalists would say, no, they're going to eventually flatline and then perhaps even decline because of environmental problems, climate change, and so on. Some pro-natalists would say we're decoupling agricultural land from food production, because if we can produce more and more food in a given area of land, then we can retire other areas of land from agriculture, return them to wild habitat or whatever. So this graph a few years back, though, is the argument being made is that global agricultural land has already declined, although, as it notes, that's particularly from pasture land. Cropland has actually continued to increase, but those who are optimistic say eventually when we get, as population stabilizes and as agricultural technology continues to develop, then eventually we'll be able to reduce total agricultural land. And already in a lot of wealthy countries, it's true in the United States, certainly true in Japan, true in much of Europe, we're seeing reforestation right now. So those deforestation maps are almost all focusing on tropical areas where deforestation is continuing, but in many temperate areas we're seeing an increase. It's kind of hard to read these maps. They're showing both grassland in lighter green and farmland in darker green. But if you look carefully, you can see an increase in farmland in Spain, Italy, France from 1900 to 2010, and that has continued. So there have been a lot of areas of marginal farmland or pasture land not being used by humans anymore, returning to nature. That's true in the United States as well. I wasn't able to find a good map, but New England in particular is much more forested today than it was in say 1900, and that's true of a number of other parts of the United States as well. Not everywhere, but many places. Also, we're seeing what is often called rewilding, and it's almost all happening in wealthy countries, meaning that not only is land returning to forest or other natural habitat, but a lot of species and a lot of sort of large mammals, charismatic megafauna, as they're sometimes called, are really increasing in numbers. So yes, in Africa, elephants are retreating. In the United States, a lot of animals are increasing. In the year 1900, deer were becoming quite scarce in most of the United States. Now they're a suburban pest. But let's take something at the top of the food chain, gray wolf, charismatic megafauna, if ever there is one. When I was young, say in the 1960s, the only places outside of Alaska that wolves lived were the far north, east of Minnesota, a little bit into Michigan and northern Wisconsin. There weren't very many. The map shows the gray wolf range in 2014. This is huge expansion. Some of this has been through intentional reintroduction. A lot of it just has been population spreading over the border from Canada and outward from existing population nuclei. So you can see here, it's interesting in this 2014, no gray wolves in California. Well, that's not true anymore. So here's a map on the bottom left of gray wolf packs in California in 2021. And there were just two, one of them in the far north Siskiyou County, one in Lassen and Plumas counties. But here's an article from just a few weeks ago that gray wolves are now in Tulare County. That would be in the southern Sierra Nevada. So wolves have expanded into California and down through much of California much, much faster than really anyone had anticipated. So there is a tremendous sort of potential for this kind of rebound and is happening in some places, generally in wealthy places. So the pro-natalist environmentalists say, well, what we need to do is bring the entire world up to that level of wealth of a place like the United States if we want to see a resurgence of wildlife. Now, of course, the anti-natalists would say that level of wealth entails a kind of resource consumption that the Earth cannot sustain, not even close, and so it will lead eventually to disaster. You can make up your own mind. Another thing that optimistic pro-natalists would argue is that some of the world's most densely populated countries are also some of the most important agricultural exporters. Something like, most crop yields are much higher in Europe than they are in the United States, and the Netherlands is really off the chart. So this is by value, and Netherlands does focus on high-value agricultural goods, from flowers to dairy products to many other sorts of things. But their yields are extremely high. It's a very technologically intensive form of agriculture, a lot of greenhouses, a lot of inputs, but it produces a bounty of agricultural of goods. And Netherlands is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. You can see here on the map of Europe, only the Netherlands and Belgium are in the highest category. Or to give you some actually numbers on it, about 18 million people in the Netherlands and about 16,000 square miles. California has a little more than twice the population, but 10 times the area, and California has a pretty large population. So there are those who would argue that if we follow the lead of a country like the Netherlands, we could produce vastly more food than we currently do. Now, of course, there are strong anti-natalist rejoinders to this denial of a population crisis. Anti-natalists would argue that there are real limits to the ability of technological progress to enhance the carrying capacity of the Earth, and that they all come at a certain cost, that we cannot just assume that these increases are going to continue forever, particularly in a world with rampant climate change. that also argue that the high-tech world that we're developing actually requires more energy, not less. Not that long ago, people were arguing things like, well, if we could develop really good quality video conferencing, then people wouldn't have to travel to business meetings and would use much less energy. Well, we have that now with Zoom, and perhaps there's maybe a little less business travel, but it hasn't changed all that much. Plus, things like cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence require a tremendous amount of energy. I'll have some slides on that later on. That also argue that things like mining the asteroids is a pipe dream, that it's so extraordinarily expensive to get off of the Earth that is just not going to happen. Of course, people like Elon Musk disagree. And argue, of course, that climate change is a huge threat and will undermine any of these techno-optimistic hopes or fantasies. Argue that there's still no solution to nuclear waste through nuclear fission, and that nuclear fusion is 30 years away and always will be, which is a tagline that's often used. There's a lot of hope that nuclear fusion will soon deliver very cheap and very clean power, but the technological obstacles are huge. Also, with agricultural intensification comes a lot of environmental problems. So in the Netherlands, they're very intensive agriculture. While it produces a lot of carbon dioxide, it also produces a lot of nitrates and phosphates, run off in the water, cause algae blooms, and so on. So the European Union and the Dutch government have been trying to increase the regulation of agriculture and actually decrease its intensivity and retire some farmlands. Dutch farmers are furious about that, and they have had sort of several of these protests, which involve taking their tractors, blocking streets, blocking highways, preventing goods from entering cities. Governments have tended to back down. It's not just in the Netherlands. This has been something that's happening in many parts of Europe. So there's a lot of tension associated with it. And just to show the surging energy demand from the high-tech sector, here's a forecast just up, showing the situation, energy consumption from 2010 projecting up to 2030, and just showing the huge increase in things like data centers. And as I said before, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency are extremely energy thirsty. And so that's leading to a possible return to nuclear power. A number of tech companies have said to run their data centers, they want to build small-scale modular nuclear power plants, or in one very widely cited case, reopening the 3 Mile Island large nuclear fission plant that was shut down after a disaster in the 1970s. Came close to a meltdown, but there is this a plan that's being contested to reopen this precisely to supply the energy needed for the high-tech sector. Anyway, looking at pro-natalist responses to anti-natalism, continuing. I started this and I gave the rejoinders, but now back to what pro-natalists saying, why we need to increase the birth rate, would be a number of arguments about the social and economic costs of lower fertility. So one is the growing dependency ratio of low fertility societies, which they argue will prove economically and socially devastating. So the dependency ratio is the number of people who are not in the workforce because they are too young or too old, or it could be too ill, but it's usually too young or too old. And so they have to be supported by people who are in the workforce. So when you have a situation with very high birth rates, you have a high dependency ratio because you have a lot of children that have to be taken care of by working age people. But then as you enter the fertility transformation, you end up with a very different situation. For a while, you're sort of in a sweet spot with a lot of working age people and not that many young. But then eventually, if fertility remains very low, that working age population is going to age, they're going to retire, and you'll end up with a a top-heavy population, too many old people, not enough young people to take care of them, to pay their Social Security, pensions, or whatever else is needed to maintain them. Argument is also made that in a society characterized by economic decline, which would happen as the population declines, competition will become increasingly fierce. People will fight more over a shrinking pie, leading to more antisocial behavior. Now, of course, the anti-natalists will argue that we need to move into a new economic model that is not dependent on growth and is looks more at things like redistribution from the wealthy to the not so wealthy. So, of course, the arguments continue. Pro-Natalists often argue that societies dominated by old people, which is the regime we're moving into, will lose their creativity because it's the young who are creative. And if you lose people in you have a very small cohort of people in their, say, 20s, 30s, they will just simply not have the creativity to come up with new responses to the challenges that are increasing. And also argue that depression, other mental health problems will increase in societies with few children, the argument being that having children around is necessary for mental health. Of course, all of these are contested. I'll get into some of the argumentation. But first, let's just take up the issue. Is it true that creativity declines with age? There's a lot of evidence that this is true. So I have an illustration in a New York Times article from a few years back, some well-known authors. Just to take one quote, why does creativity generally decline as we age? So they're taking this as a given. But one reason may be that as we grow old, we know more. That is mostly an advantage, of course, but it may lead us to ignore evidence that contradicts what we already think. We may become too set in our ways to change. And this is something that psychologists have confirmed, something called the confirmation bias. We tend to accept information that confirms what we already think. And as this increases, we grow older. I'm not so sure. A lot of people would suggest, though, that this is too simplistic. We have to instead look at different kinds of creativity. And so actually, I found it useful to go to ChatGPT for this because it came up with this answer, which was sort of in the back of my mind, but the difference between fluid creativity, or we can talk about fluid intelligence, which is basically raw computational power of the human brain. As they put it here, the ability to come up with novel ideas quickly. It's often associated with youth. Tasks that require rapid problem solving or innovation may feel more challenging as we age. And it is generally true that cutting-edge mathematicians or physicists generally make their breakthroughs when they're fairly young. Not always, there are exceptions, but there are a lot more mathematical new proofs developed by people in their 20s and 30s than people in their 60s or 70s. This may also be true with music. It's also debatable. But if you look at songwriters, I think, let's just take an example of general consensus is the two greatest songwriters of the 20th century were Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan, both still alive, active into their 80s. And I don't think there are many people who would say that most of their best songs came after they turned 30, 40, whatever. Most of that intense creativity happened in their 20s or up into their 30s. I mean, actually, I personally think Bob Dylan wrote many of his greatest songs in his 30s. That's a minority view. But when you get to the 60s and 70s, there's some interesting songs, but it's not the same. I actually heard an interesting interview with Paul Simon, another well-known songwriter, who said, when I was young, it was so easy to write songs. They just come into my mind, and now I just have to work so hard at it. So there's some evidence for this. But then there's something called crystallized intelligence or crystallized creativity, which involves drawing on accumulated knowledge, skills, life experiences, which often improves with age. We might call this wisdom. But in some fields, I think it's true in history, arguably in literature perhaps as well, creativity doesn't really seem to decline. So it depends on what we're looking at. It is undeniable that in wealthy countries, the old age dependency ratio is really increasing. This map shows it from 2017. It would be much more, more blue today, as especially places like Japan that saw really early declines in fertility get these populations dominated by older people, and also increases in longevity exacerbate the problem. And so you just have an awful lot of retirees who have to be supported. Well, now let's turn for a while to the anti-natalist rejoinders to these arguments about the social and economic costs of low fertility. So people who are really worried about population often think that those who are worried about fertility decline are exaggerating. So one argument is the dependency problem. Too many old people. It can be solved, and it is, by the immigration of young working age people to low fertility countries. That's happening not so much in East Asia. It is to some degree, but it's happening in a very significant extent in United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and in most of Europe. So the elderly population is being supported in part by young, vigorous immigrants in the prime of their life. Argument is also made that as health and longevity increase, the retirement age can be increased. If you increase your retirement age, you decrease the dependency burden. Another argument is for elderly people is that migrants and robots can help care for them. And they would also argue that the presence of children is not necessary for human happiness and fulfillment. You can be plenty happy without having a lot of children around. Now, it's undeniable that the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia have seen a lot of immigration, and that has, well, until quite recently, been generally assumed that it would continue. And I'm talking about immigration, both documented and undocumented immigration. But here we have a United Nations population projection, and you can see it's projecting the population of Brazil to peak, plateau, and then decline. Brazil is not a country that attracts many immigrants. It did at one time. It doesn't anymore. It sends out more people than it brings in, probably. I should have to check that. But the United States brings in a lot more people than it sends out. So the UN is projecting that the U.S. population is going to continue upward. It's going to be over 400 million within 50 years or so. And retirement age has been increasing in the United States. It's interesting for men, from this graph from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, it actually decreased in the 80s, but then has been on an upturn since about 1989. For women, it's been going up steadily. For full Social Security benefits, we just have this sort of ratcheting effect where it continues to go up. If you're born after 1960, now you have to wait till 67 years old. Robotic elder care is happening, particularly in Japan. It's definitely a thing. And there are plenty of techno-optimists who think that there's a real robotics revolution at hand, that robots, their abilities have been pretty limited heretofore, but there is hope that AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics are coming together, and then we'll finally have this robotics revolution where robots will be able to do all sorts of things. Maybe. It's also true that children are not necessarily needed for human happiness. At least that's what people say. In the United States, this is a Pew Research Center, the gold standard for public opinion polling. But the question is, what do you need to be happy and have a fulfilling life? And number one is a job or career. Number two is close friends. But you can see having children dropping way down. And many people saying that having children, almost 42%, almost 50%, with 42 saying that children are not too important or not important at all. Now, of course, there are pro-natalist responses to these anti-natalists are rejoinders against pro-natalism. So just continuing in this back and forth. Pro-natalists argue that opposition to large-scale immigration in the wealthy world is pronounced and it is rapidly increasing. And We're seeing things like the election of Donald Trump to the United States for the second time, who campaigned strongly on reducing at least illegal or undocumented immigration as anything else, and is talking about deporting millions of people. Another argument is that most countries that are providing immigrants to the wealthy world are now experiencing their own fertility collapses. There's not much migration from sub-Saharan Africa to the United States. There's some. There certainly may be more in the future, but most immigrants to the United States are coming from places like Northern Central America, which not long ago had high birth rates, but they're now down at replacement level or lower and are dropping. And so they're not going to continue to have these very large cohorts of young adults in the prime of their working lives looking to better themselves and move to a place like the United States. Now, difference in wages can still be a draw, but as we saw, when we looked at Bhutan, for example, there's concern in a number of developing countries that they may hollow out their own population. Voters are also rejecting increases of retirement age, particularly in Europe. I have a slide I'll show you about this later on. There's a feeling that there was basically a social compact made that we will work for so many years, and pay our fair share in taxes, but then we get to retire. And you can't change the deal now and increase the retirement age. And many people, I would say, are appalled by the prospect of being cared for by robots in their final years. And most, it's hard to say, but certainly many want children and grandchildren. So just one graph on increasing opposition to large-scale immigration to the United States. It's true in Europe as well. This is by party identification. It's interesting. You can see from 2015 to 2020, there was a general downward trend in the line, and what these lines are showing is percent dissatisfied with the level of immigration and wanting it decreased. But then look what happened after 2021 when Joe Biden came into the White House. The immigration rate, particularly of undocumented people, greatly increased, and that resulted in a tremendous hostility to this. So you can see for Republicans now up to 71% want it decreased for and this is overall immigration too, and 36% of independents, and Democrats only 19%, but up a lot since 2023. And we could do the same thing with different European countries. And as far as raising the retirement age, and so in France, efforts to raise the retirement age pretty modestly from 62 to 64 resulted in massive protests, essentially taking down the government and forcing the government to retreat on this. And as the sign here says from a French protest, work is bad for health after you reach 60 years of age. And there's also evidence that lack of children and of grandchildren here is causing some grief and psychological despair. Here's a New York Times recent article on the unspoken grief of never becoming a grandparent. And I have to say, I talked to a lot of people my age, friends and colleagues, who are basically in the position of losing hope that they will ever have grandchildren. And for a lot of them, it's not easy. It's a difficult sort of thing. In Japan, interestingly, they have a rent a grandchild industry, a whole rent a family industry where you can pay money to have an adorable young child spend time with you and pretend to be your grandchild, essentially. I don't think that will happen in the United States. Okay, back to a different topic here. So if pro-natalists want to increase the birth rate, how do they want to do it? So we looked at how anti-natalists wanted to decrease it. Well, how do pro-natalists want to increase it? So we started with the pro-natalists with subsidies, so I'll start with that. I'll start with the anti-natalists with subsidies, so we'll do the same with pro-natalists. So it's very interesting to take the case of Singapore, because Singapore went from anti-natalism to pro-natalism almost overnight when the government realized that the birth rate was very, very low. It's only about one child per woman now, and that would result in a greatly decreasing population, unless it's made up for by immigration. But Singapore's happy to have highly skilled immigrants. They certainly don't want unskilled immigrants. So you could see what some of these entailed: increased maternity leave, covered for 4 children, child benefits increased, government-sponsored dating agencies, government-sponsored child care, discouraging now sterilization and abortion, formerly encouraged, population planning and board abolished. Parents with good academic qualifications get enhanced benefits for children. It's kind of a eugenic idea of encouraging the most educated to reproduce. Many countries, though, have been doing all sorts of subsidies. It's big in Scandinavia, as you can see here, the amazing parental leave. And Norway has universal child benefits and up to 44 weeks of full wage replacement. That's for single parents, but there are also child care services, cash for child care, care services for the elderly. So in a social democratic model with high taxes and a productive economy, which Norway has, they're putting a lot of resources into this. Other Nordic countries have done it as well. So here we have a map just showing statutory, in other words, by law, paternity leaves just for fathers. So you can see Sweden up to 34 weeks, and you can see fairly substantial in Norway and Iceland and Spain. Interestingly, a lot of countries that are trying to increase their birth rate. This summer, I've spent some time with a young Swedish couple with a young child. And we were talking about what daycare costs, and they're living in Stockholm, and I think the figure they gave was $150 a month. When my wife and I told them what you would have to pay in Palo Alto, California, they were staggered and could hardly imagine how anyone could afford to have a child in that kind of circumstance. Interesting, though, the correlation between something like paternal leave and total fertility rate is not that great. So you can see here the U.S. with no statutory leave. It depends on the company. Israel with a pretty minor one. While Israel has by far the largest birth rate in the developed world, South Korea has some pretty high levels of child subsidy sort of across the board, yet they have the lowest fertility rate in the world, probably. So there's quite a bit of evidence that this subsidizing childbearing it can have an effect. It certainly can increase the fertility rate, but it seems to be pretty modest. So Hungary has done overall terms. It didn't appear on the leave map, but in general subsidies, it's been, I think it has the highest in all of Europe. But this Financial Times article from the Financial Times arguing why Hungary's lavish family subsidies fail to spur a fertility boom. But you could just see couples receiving more than 80,000 euros in grants and loans. You can get a 4th baby, they will pardon the entire sum. Even loans for buying minivans, to fit them all in. Well, what has been the effect? Well, it was an effect. So you could see the total fertility rate here in Hungary was only around 1.2 in 2010. Viktor Orban, the very conservative leader of Hungary, very worried about depopulation. His government pushed through these subsidies, and you could see the birth rate went up to about 1.6. That's about where it is in the United States. But last couple of years ago, it's fallen. It's down to 1.5. So that's not hyper low fertility, but it's a long way from the replacement level. It's also significantly lower than what's lower than Norway or Sweden. So another topic here of how pro-natalists hope to increase the birth rate. Well, one is trying to change cultural values and expectations. I know it's not easily done, but here's an article from Palladium, Governance Futurism, arguing that the fertility collapse demands new cultures. So in order to make the leap to a culture that does support sustainable birth rates, we need to create new cultures. What does that mean? How do you do it? One thing that's quite clear is anti-natalists are afraid that this so-called cultural change basically means going back to previous patriarchal cultures that would entail the resubjugation of women. That's the fear anyway. So an article here from Countercurrents, left-wing source, about how patriarchal pro-natalism dominates the conversation about the human future. So there's definite linkage of the pro-natalist stance to patriarchal male-dominated social organization. To quote from it, pro-natalism serves powerful institutions of the state, the church, military, and the economy by preaching that parenthood is an obligation, not a choice. Pro-natalism runs so deep in our society and is so pervasive that to this day it colors the most important policy discussions and social norms. And then going on, as the Earth system groans under the burden of too many people consuming too much stuff, a new twist on this ubiquitous ideology, one that contemptuously sees women as mere procreative vessels, plays out on the global stage. Countering that is the Norwegian demographer Mads Larsen, very much a pro-natalist, very concerned about low birth rates in his own Norway and in other developed countries, sees it as a disaster in the making. But he also totally rejects the notion that we need to return to a patriarchal society. He says in Norway, that's just, it's never going to happen. People who want that sort of thing in Norway are very few in number. Even the pro-natalists don't want to go that way, which is one reason why Norway and Sweden, other Nordic countries, have pushed paternal leave as well, emphasizing that men should be just as involved in women in child care. I have a very interesting interview with Mads Larsen by Chris Williamson, a British podcaster, interviewer, not too long ago. And the one thing that Larsen says here over and over again is that we need to think openly and creatively about how to change the culture to encourage childbearing. But he didn't say what he wanted. So I did it wasn't very difficult to do, but looked into some searches of what he really wants. And here's an article, a recent article from a couple of years ago, basically claiming that we need polygyny, or that's a form of polygamy. Polygyny is where one man will have multiple wives. So he says we need to be open to this. One of the things he argues is that one of the reasons why the Norwegian birth rate has dropped so much is because there are a lot of young Norwegians who want to have children, want to get married and have children, but they do not get married and do not have children. And one reason why they're not getting married is that many young women are just claiming there aren't enough quality young men to go around, men who will make good husbands and will do their fair share of child rearing, and that has resulted in the decline of marriage rate and birth rate. So he says, well, quality men then got to be open to them having more than one wife. And there are other sorts of things, other ways you could imagine reimagining the family to allow more fertility that does not involve any sort of return to patriarchy, like highly subsidized single motherhood, polygyny, I just mentioned it, polyamory. There's a lot more talk about that. Polycules, groups of people in sexual relations living together and forming child-rearing collectives. Now, one of the problems, though, is that the pro-natalist community is generally on the socially conservative side, and that is, these are not things they want at all. And certainly polygyny is not something that most feminists want either, so it is very difficult to really see these as viable responses. Although things change and culture is in flux, so perhaps that something of the future. Integrating grandparents into childbearing is more acceptable to social conservatives. And there's been talk about this, that young families are under a lot of financial stress, they're under a lot of time stress, they're under housing stress. At the same time, we have a lot of people my age, in the 60s, 70s or so, who have a lot of time on their hands, they're retired, they have money on their hands, they're overhoused, And we perhaps could go back more to a situation that we had historically where there was more integration. So less of a nuclear family, more of a extended or STEM family, however you want to look at it. And by integrating grandparents, that can be beneficial. So here's an article, a recent scholarly publication. Receiving grandparental support has positive and significant impact on women's but not men's fertility intentions. So that's interesting. So if the grandparents are going to be highly involved, that's going to help. This is a topic very, very close to home to me because I am in this situation. My wife and I are. Our son and daughter-in-law have 3 children. They may end up having more. And the only way they are able to do that is because of help from my wife and I, and also my daughter-in-law's parents, who contribute a lot to childcare. We contribute financially, and so on. So we've made this decision that we're going to support this relative, by American standards, quite high level of fertility of this young couple as grandparents, and we definitely find it psychologically fulfilling and a very positive thing to do. But that's going to vary. Not all grandparents are eager for this. I know a lot of people who say, I've worked hard and I want to be traveling, I want to be enjoying life, I don't want to be saddled with this sort of thing. So it varies a lot. Anyway, my last slide here is the big question. Well, why have global fertility rates fallen so sharply since around 1963, as you can see for this line? And I have on this slide some possible answers. I'm not going to go into it now because that's what I hope to explore over the rest of this course. So this is the second lecture. I anticipate probably there'll be something like 15, 16 lectures in this series. The next one is going to actually go way back and look at human population in ancient times and prehistorical times, all the way back to the origin of humankind. So to address these kind of questions is going to take basically the rest of this lecture course. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you can tune in for the other lectures in the Geocurrent series on global demography. Thank you.